So next panel is about taxonomy. And it's my pleasure to invite my good friend, Louise Gardiner, the Climate Finance Practice Lead in IFC and SBFN's advisor, and has been a long-term member of the Secretariat. Louise, floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. So I feel like there's a lot of pressure on this panel, but hopefully we'll rise to the occasion. I also want to point out that one of my favorite things about South Africans is they'll very quickly point out what you need to improve on. So Tabang has said we need more African voices. I've tried my best with my dress. Now I need the other Africans in the room to please speak up. And incidentally, some of the work that we're doing on taxonomy alignment is at the request of South Africa's National Treasury saying, we've got this taxonomy now. You helped us do one that's aligned with the EU. Can we please start moving towards interoperability and making this work? So I love that this is how SBFN operates. We get requests from you, and we do our best to respond to them. So with that, I'd like to invite the panelists for this session to please come up. We have Dilrukshini, Assistant Governor for the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. Lucia Marin, who is Deputy Head of Unit for the European Commission DG Financial Stability, and also representing the International Platform on Sustainable Finance. We have Rustam Tahirov, who is the Director of the Financial Sector Sustainable Development Department at Central Bank of Azerbaijan. Karina Velasquez, who is Executive Secretary for the Central American Council of Superintendents of Banks and Insurance. And then from the Climate Bonds Initiative, Sofia Vetmanska, who is the Taxonomy Manager and is currently working on Common Ground Taxonomy version 2, or the extension, so she's deep in the weeds of taxonomy development. So let me move over. Okay, is this working? Yeah, it's working. Okay, so there were a few mentions of taxonomies this morning and yesterday, and the need for alignment and the risks of not being aligned. And I think one of the things I've discovered in our work over the last 2 years, working with SBFN members and various emerging markets on taxonomies, is it's not that there's a lack of desire to align. There is, in fact, a very strong desire to align. But there's also a very real recognition that we're in a learning phase. So some of the taxonomies that we have were developed before things like the EU taxonomy came around or the Common Ground taxonomy. And some of the taxonomies are designed for markets that are maybe less mature than other markets, and where a lot of capacity building and awareness raising has to happen first. The market needs to learn what a taxonomy is, and banks need to figure out how to use them. There's another interesting aspect to this, and I've heard this from several banking associations yesterday and today, is that banking associations can work very closely with their banks to figure out what can work in terms of taxonomies. And that's the critical thing. The taxonomies are meant to do something. They're meant to drive capital flows. And everyone wants those capital flows to happen and for us to be working to these ambitious goals. So that's, I think, much of the time right now is not the issue. It's not the lack of ambition. It's how do we make this work in practice. So we heard yesterday about the initiative being led by the Central Bank of Azerbaijan. And this panel now brings together key players in this space who can help us think through how do we work towards harmonization in a way that is practical and helps us move forward. So with that, I'm going to ask each of the panelists to just introduce themselves and their perspective and their experience in line with a few kind of key guiding questions. So the first one for Dilrukshini from Central Bank of Sri Lanka. So you published a Green Taxonomy in 2022. And you've used the Common Ground taxonomy as a basis. So that's one of the ideas going forward, is that that's something that countries can leverage. And so you've had some time now to think about how this will be implemented in your market. Can you tell us a little bit about that process and what you've learned?
Thank you for your question. And before I begin, let me acknowledge I'm not a taxonomy expert. I'm a macroprudential expert. But anyway, I led the project on this sustainable finance at the Central Bank of Sri Lanka, where we started from 2017. We became a member of SBFN, and then 2022 when we launched the taxonomy. So we started to work on the taxonomy in 2021. Sri Lanka went through a BOP crisis, debt crisis, and we were in a debt standstill. But when we were doing the taxonomy, we understood the importance of making the taxonomy acceptable to the world. So the interoperability was one concern which was raised by the central bank plus the other stakeholders, especially by the banking sector, because banking sector after the crisis, after the debt restructuring process is over, banking sector had the need of tapping international markets. So we thought of making the taxonomy, base the taxonomy on common ground taxonomy. In addition to that, when come to key sectors, we align our taxonomy with our national climate policies. So we brought in, the tourism sector, which where there is because there's a real drive to make tourism sustainable in Sri Lanka, which is they are not in the common ground taxonomy. So what I would like to say, while you are thinking of the interoperability of the taxonomies, you have to think of your local context as well. So I thought building the taxonomy is the most challenging task, but when we started to operationalize the taxonomy, I understand that the operationalizing the taxonomy is not easy. First thing is because taxonomies are anyway technical documents. But I had some foresight while working with all these international experts. I brought in one local expert to work with us while we are doing the taxonomy. So that local expert, became really useful when we started to operationalize the taxonomy. So my advice, when you're doing it, bring some local resources. Otherwise, it's not easy. After we launched the taxonomy, we as the regulator of the banking and the non-bank financial institutions sector, we issued a direction making the compliance of the taxonomy by the banks and non-bank financial institution mandatory. And then the disclosure requirement was brought in. Then the next step was to basically get the supervisors to supervise in their examinations, to supervise whether the banks are in compliance with the direction. So when you are going to supervise whether the banks are into compliance, then there came an issue because, it's not only the regulators, banks should be thorough on the taxonomy. It's the regulators also need to be very thorough on the taxonomy. There we faced the capacity issue. Then we began to provide some capacity building programs by the central bank using our training arm. So capacity was built in. In addition to that, banks started questioning us on different criteria mentioned in the taxonomy. So we built an expert group that the banks can approach this expert group through the central bank to raise their concerns. So that was another step that we have taken. Whatever said and done, I know that there are capacity gaps still. It's not easy to, make the banks aware because even banks, these, credit officers, they are not used to this taxonomies, right? So that is our priority to, bring all on the same ground to operationalize the taxonomy. In addition to that, now, because this taxonomy, the banking sector has accepted, non-bank financial institutions are in compliance with the taxonomy, and then Colombo Stock Exchange, they also have developed corporate green and blue bond guidelines based on the taxonomy. So there's a requirement coming up for IFRS S1, S2 sustainability disclosures, which is to be effective from 1st of January 2025. So now we understand that we need to deep dive on our capacity development process. So, it is very easy to talk about taxonomies, but, operationalizing the taxonomy is not easy. And then now there's another requirement from the market, because this taxonomy is based on green. It's a green taxonomy, but market is coming up with their requirement on incorporating social aspects, especially financial inclusion, and then women financing, another part of financial inclusion. So we are working on our roadmap 2.0 with the IFC. After we launch our roadmap 2.0, we are planning to extend our taxonomy to incorporate social aspects. So these taxonomies are dynamic documents. It won't stay as you develop it. That has to change with the time, cater to the market needs. So that's it from me.
Thank you so much. So it highlights an interesting aspect, which is when we talk about a common core, like what the common ground taxonomy is, that is a way to align on really high stakes activities, maybe related to climate change. But what we've seen is definitely the desire in emerging markets to innovate quickly in terms of additional activities that are either relevant to the local market conditions, like sustainable tourism, or address social issues. And when the National Bank of Georgia, for instance, wanted to develop their social taxonomy, they were asking for what is the international good practice, where can they go for examples, but they had to push ahead on their own with some of their social categories. So there's still quite a bit of innovation to happen. In South Africa, for instance, there's a huge amount of demand for agricultural activities to be added, but we're still working with an initial set of activities that people are getting used to, but that holds the banks back from then doing green lending to agriculture as soon as they would like to. So we've talked to a country that has an established taxonomy. Rustam, Azerbaijan is now moving towards completing your taxonomy, and you've learned from the lessons of other countries, and you've thought about what does it mean for Azerbaijan, and you're also now driving this initiative towards harmonization. Can you talk a little bit about what you've learned through this process and what benefits you think you can get from this harmonization initiative?
Thank you, Louise. Again, it's a great honor to be here with distinguished experts. And our central bank joining SBFN happened 2022, and it coincided with central bank adopted roadmap for sustainable finance. And we got full support from SBFN, starting from onboarding and then more specialized, including taxonomy development. Actually, it put a very firm ground for our agenda. And we are thankful for this opportunity, and we collaborate with member countries, National Bank of Georgia, National Bank of Kazakhstan, Astana Financial Center, which exchange of experience and knowledge are really important. So, as you said, central bank is committed to issue its taxonomy this year, and our general target is to have the full legal and regulatory framework for sustainable finance ecosystem in order to enable the products, financial sustainable finance products to grow in the market. And as you said, along with our internal agenda, we decided to follow this journey of enhancing interoperability of sustainable finance taxonomy. Yesterday, we talked about it briefly. I informed of a view of key work streams. And today, I would like to emphasize some of the key aspects and go more deeper. First of all, the objective. And want to be clear that this roadmap is not about single taxonomy, is not about fully synchronizing taxonomies. It is about interoperability of taxonomies. And as I yesterday cited a survey result from high net worth investors, their confusion about sustainable finance investing. So it is the purpose of the roadmap is to enable investors and other market participants be able to compare what is happening in one country with its own set of circumstances to another country with its own circumstances. So, and we want all you to be ambassadors of this journey. And therefore, I wanted to make sure that we are on the same page. And yesterday, we talked about 5 work streams. Today, I want to touch a few aspects of transition finance. So far, particularly in the last decade, world largely focused on energy transition, renewables, and we see great, impressive achievements, particularly in developed countries. It's very encouraging when we see that renewables, part of renewables in energy mix is going higher and higher, particularly in Europe and other developed countries. Even in Azerbaijan, we target to increase renewables in energy mix by to 30%. And it is one of the key targets for Azerbaijan. At the same time, many policymakers, practitioners say that it was the first stage, energy transition, and they call it less challenging. And they say most challenging part is ahead to decarbonize high-emitting sectors, which those sectors are specific to many emerging countries, developing countries, and those countries are largely reliant on these high emission specific sectors. And so here we need transitions, and therefore transition is one of the work streams that we presented in the draft roadmap. Second, when coming from these, we need to identify transition activities. So we see that EU taxonomy is identifying transition activities. Some other taxonomies in the form of whitelist, they largely focus on green, clean sectors. And also the principle-based taxonomies look at it from, as name says, from principle-based and look at General Paris Agreement climate target perspective. So here we need some alignment, how to align and identify transition activities. It is one of the most challenging in alignment, as I said yesterday. it will not be easy task. And particularly some sectors would be very difficult to achieve alignment, particularly those sectors that rely on local legislations standards that are not very much aligned internationally. So like building sectors, and it will be one of the challenging areas of the alignment process. And I want also finalize my intervention here about inclusion, and which is work stream 5 in roadmap. It is very important for developing countries. Many countries, including Azerbaijan, still has issues with inclusion. And we have a financial inclusion, first nationwide financial inclusion program, strategy. And at the same time, we see that we need to be careful in green transition to make sure that, as rightly told in morning earlier sessions, households, farmers, micro and small entrepreneurs are not left behind. Just let's imagine that big corporations, for example, grocery chain is getting food or milk from hundreds or thousands of small farmers. And if they start transition, they will affect those small entrepreneurs. So it needs to be aligned in order to make sure that those will not be disadvantaged from this process, from this transition. So generally, this is some of the aspects that will be critical in taxonomy alignment process. I would like to conclude here by thanking SBFN and IPCF their support for this initiative, and look forward continuing in this direction. Thank you.
Thanks, Rustam, and thank you for providing a really powerful example of the inclusion challenge. I think that's a really great way to understand what the potential impact could be if we create taxonomies and frameworks that exclude the participation of a large part of the market. I think you've also touched on the opportunity that we have through the taxonomy discussion, now that we can collaborate more on it, to actually tackle the difficult parts of sustainable finance. I think we've come through a learning, maybe a 3 to 5 year learning period where, 3 years ago, we had to start these presentations with a definition of what is a taxonomy. Now we don't have to do that. Everyone knows what it is, what the key moving parts are. And once you know what the moving parts are, then you can start with manipulating the sensitivities in that taxonomy for your market and what you're trying to achieve. So that kind of collaboration, so I'm going to move on to Karina, who's herding cats. So looking at the work that you're doing at the regional level in Central America to build a foundation that all the supervisors can use to build out taxonomies in Central American countries. And this is a golden opportunity to create a foundation in harmonization, but it's a difficult job. So how is that going, and what have you learned? Because what you're learning provides a foundation for what Rustam wants to achieve through the roadmap.
Thank you, Louise. Good morning, everyone. First of all, I want to thank the National Banking and Insurance Commission of Honduras for its leadership in coordinating and managing this project, because it has been a commendable effort along this process. So getting into the subject, I would like to highlight 5 key successes that we have achieved so far. The first one is collaboration across borders, as you said. One of our greatest achievements has been bringing together 8 countries through their supervisory agencies under a unified framework. This collaborative effort has fostered regional cooperation and allowed for a more cohesive and coordinated approach to sustainable finance across Central America. Working as a united front has greatly strengthened our ability to make a lasting impact. The second one is partnerships with global institutions. Since entering into the cooperation agreement, we have been collaborating with key global players. In particular, the IFC has provided the expertise and resources significantly accelerating the development of the taxonomy. This partnership has been instrumental in ensuring that our framework is robust and aligned with international best practices. And this one, Foundation for National Taxonomies. The regional taxonomy serves as a blueprint for the development of national taxonomies, giving individual countries a clear path to adapt the framework to their unique context. By offering a consistent yet flexible model, we are empowering countries to develop their own taxonomies, such as the case of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, which can address their specific needs while maintaining alignment with the broader regional and global goals. And one of this is harmonization with international standards, as our colleagues had said. Aligning the taxonomy with global initiatives like the EU Green Taxonomy and Common Land Framework has been key to ensuring the region remains competitive and attractive to international investors. By harmonizing with these widely recognized standards, we are positioning Central America as a viable destination for green finance and ensuring that our efforts are integrated into the global movement towards sustainability. So if I can talk about two main challenges also. These are alignment with diverse national context. The region includes countries with varying levels of economic development and regulatory environments, making it challenging to create a one-size-fits-all taxonomy. Ensuring that the framework accommodates this difference while maintaining coherence has been a complex task. I think it's the most complex task. Balancing voluntary and mandatory frameworks. I think is another key challenge has been striking the right balance between voluntary adoption of the taxonomy and moving towards mandatory frameworks. On the one hand, the taxonomy needs to be flexible enough to encourage to be flexible to voluntary adoption by financial institutions and investors. On the other hand, we have recognized that mandatory implementation will eventually be necessary to achieve the full impact of this initiative. This balance has required careful considerations, especially in light of the different legal and economic environments across the region. At last, the decision on whether to make the taxonomy mandatory will rest with each country's superintendencies. We like a Babylonic decision. Moving to the next step briefly, I will list the following: capacity building and training. Continuing to build capacity within member countries is essential. CCSBSO plans to roll out more training programs to ensure financial institutions and regulators can effectively implement and monitor the taxonomy, and developing sector-specific guidelines. As the taxonomy evolves, there will be a focus on creating sector-specific guidelines that cater to high-impact areas like energy, agriculture, and infrastructure, where the greatest opportunities for low-carbon investment exist, and strengthening cross-border supervision. In line with the core values and the mandate of our organization, enhancing consolidated and cross-border supervision will ensure that financial institutions comply with the taxonomy and that capital flows towards truly sustainable projects, minimizing the risk of greenwashing. I think I try to organize all the things that I want to say because are more than this, but I do my best.
You did great. Thank you very much. I think some of the themes that come through for me again and again is particularly around capacity building and knowing that particularly banks, and you talked about credit officers, this is now a learning process that the banks need to go through, and maybe that is part of the delay in actually using taxonomies, because we're not overall. I think China has a great success story of, bringing in their taxonomy in 2015, and then in 2016 they were 30% of global green bond issuance. So it was, a Chinese success story where they deployed it and they got the results in terms of capital flows. But other countries are not experiencing the same sort of hitting the ground running. And a lot of that is, it just takes time to understand what a taxonomy is and where you fit it in. And also, what does mandatory mean? What are you making mandatory? Are you saying that all instruments need to be aligned with the taxonomy? Is it only your national taxonomy? Is it other taxonomies? Georgia has given options. You don't have to just use the National Bank of Georgia's taxonomy. You can use other taxonomies, including the Climate Bonds Initiative. So I want to move to Zofia, our woman in the trenches. So you see the tremendous detail in taxonomies and how to make these things work. You also leverage the leadership of Climate Bonds Initiative, which had the first proper taxonomy in 2012, and it's linked to your climate bond standard and how bonds are aligned with the CBI standard. And you're very involved. You have experience from the EU taxonomy, and you're involved in discussions around harmonization. Okay, so from a real in the trenches practitioner, what does that look like, and what do you see as the key priorities for aligning taxonomy development and use?
Easy question, of course. As everything with taxonomy, thanks first of all to organizers and participants. I've learned a lot, and thank you so much. It has been great today. Maybe I wanted to start with reference to Monty Python. Every time we start working with taxonomies with any of the countries, they all start with saying we're all individuals. We have special circumstances. All of the other countries have it easier. Ours is a very special case. And to be fair, that is to some extent the case, but only to some extent. As in, if you think about it, all of us would say the same sentence. And that's why harmonization is quite difficult and interoperability is quite difficult. But then we need to think about it from a very top-down perspective. We do not expect the same levels of ambition, because 1.5 for country islands, it means something very different than 1.5 for Germany. So in that very concept of taxonomy, that difference is very much embedded. But what we want to see is that the principles for the taxonomy development process are the same and are maintained, as in we define 1.5, we define the objective, even if that means different thresholds for different countries. We can compare frameworks that are 1.5 aligned. If we are comparing 1.5 with 3 degrees, then that's a completely different story. We want to see those principles help us define what are the environmental objectives. We need to have common definitions of environmental objectives, because again, then only and only then we are able to make these comparisons. So from going from that top-down level of principles, and I'd refer to G20 very timely, the principles that have been embedded there align with the EU principles of how taxonomy is perceived, and many countries do refer to that. So I think that's the first step. Then when we talk about design, we need to talk about the architecture. If the structure of the taxonomy is very different for every country, then discussing interoperability becomes an impossible task. And given that there is an evolution process, we see that early taxonomies are different than what we see emerging today, but we see that the concept is evolving and the approaches are merging into something that commonly is well understood and well accepted by the market. So I would encourage definitely looking at the structures that are working today and that work for the market. And then we go deep down into the metrics. Again, we do not expect the same values, but we need to have the values that we can compare across countries. So we need to use the same metrics. We need to look at the well-acknowledged and common practices on how market actually measures the emissions, the intensity of emissions, and other indicators that that help us to put requirements and criteria together. So I would really encourage this top-down approach of aligning, even if your country has a very specific starting point, very different characteristics than all others. So that's when it comes to priorities for development. Priorities when it comes to use, I think I want to touch on two things. So mandatory versus voluntary. I'm not sure if we want to harmonize that, as in different approaches work for different countries. So to expect a mandatory approach in emerging markets that is today not very well adjusted, and the market needs to learn on how to report, how to collect the relevant data, that takes time. So that phase-in approach that is getting slightly more traction, and more taxonomies are being phased in on the voluntary basis over time to become that mandatory approach. We think that's better suited than aiming for mandatory from day one and then seeing the market sort of in the short term panicking, because the whole lessons learned process needs to happen. So I'm not sure if that voluntary versus mandatory is a sort of a choice that we need to make today. Perhaps it's more of a process that we need to look at. And then for some of the markets, voluntary approach is just sufficient. If you look at Japan, the culture that allows you to introduce those frameworks on the voluntary basis, and they're going to be picked up easily. So it differs across, and I wouldn't emphasize here the need for harmonization. However, for the use case, what is the taxonomy end purpose? Because taxonomy is very much a technical tool, but what it's used for, that's a bit of a different story. It's slightly out of our hands when we are designing the taxonomy, but it does impact how the taxonomy is designed. And essentially there are two use cases, right? So for the disclosures and for the use of proceeds for the bonds market. And if I were to emphasize any of the use cases, I would encourage to think about taxonomies and use of proceeds, because that's a very low-hanging fruit that can sort of have helped to have the effect that you were talking about in China, as in you know what to invest, you know where to, and how to redirect the financial flows, and that link between taxonomy and use of proceeds is fairly logical next step. So perhaps that is something worth emphasizing. So yeah, easy question. Sorry.
Thank you so much, Sophia. And I think the use of proceeds point is very relevant, because you might want different rules for different use cases. And China, again, is a very good example where the requirements, for instance, around assurance for taxonomy alignment for green bond issuance is there. It's stricter, but for green loan reporting, they don't require an independent verification. They just require that the financial institution must have an internal audit structure that will then take care of making sure that it's authentic alignment, and that if the regulator wants to come in and do some sort of audit, that structure can facilitate checking from a supervision point of view. But maybe coming to IPSF, and the EU has had such a big impact globally on how taxonomies are framed and used, and it has been embedded so quickly in regulation. I think it's one of the few countries where it's immediately emerged as a regulation, and it was immediately linked to disclosure, and the EU has then been able to iron out the challenges and the difficulties of using a taxonomy. And then through IPSF, you are leveraging that experience to support the development of taxonomies globally. So it'd be really nice to hear what you're seeing from your perspective and what is really needed in terms of this alignment approach.
Thank you. So maybe just to also introduce a bit IPSF, the International Platform on Sustainable Finance. I don't know if it's maybe so known to all of you. This is a partnership, is a very quite informal body among 20 jurisdictions, Sri Lanka being one of them, and actually we're working very closely also with Sophia, with CBI. And this came together really actually with this goal. The very beginning of the IPSF was that one, to bring regulators. So it's from a financial services perspective only, financial regulators together, and to think about interoperability of financial flows. And again, why? and that's, I think, also the question you have for the taxonomy, why we were brought together, is to think how we can actually make investments flows across borders in an easier way. And this came, I have to say with proud, we developed this report on alignment approaches actually very early, and this became then the G20 principles that are now coding for taxonomies. And so we are very proud to have been kind of at the beginning and influencing that, setting those principles. And we strongly believe that actually they work, and if jurisdictions follow them, I'm not saying it's easy to follow them, but if you really try to apply them in their spirit, I think the interoperability, maybe not harmonization as the title of the panel says, but interoperability can be achieved. So this is IPSF, and indeed we, as EU, we provide the secretariat. But again, today I'm here more with the secretariat hat, so not necessarily European, but. We can, I mean, of course, and it's natural, we have our, of course, experience in the EU, and it's true that we had this kind of comprehensive approach from the very beginning. So what we always say in our presentations, I think some of you, if you heard, we are already bored, but we say we had our pillars, we had the disclosures, we had the taxonomy, and we had the instruments. And here we're saying instruments, indeed, is the green bond or is the benchmarks, the climate benchmarks that we had in the EU. And we do believe that you need this kind of comprehensive to make the taxonomy work, to have a comprehensive approach and to push it, because otherwise it's true, you can have it indeed on a voluntary basis, and we're not saying this is the only approach, but if you make it meaningful and get traction, you need several angles, and probably to the instruments indeed to have bonds based on, and we are not saying 100%, but to have a bond saying which is the type of alignment with taxonomy is important to have that push. And as IPSF, actually the let's say the biggest achievement, and we heard the word mentioned, is the common ground. So the China-EU work done within the IPSF to precisely have this kind of among the first at least, methodologies for comparing taxonomies and for implementing the principles and to see how they look actually. And what Sophia actually mentioned, and they are working with IPSF, so to be very transparent, is that if you look at the principles and you say, okay, what are the environmental objectives, some common language, this ISIC, the classification system, the indicators, things can become easier, not easy, but easier. Embedding international practices or international standards, international agreements, if you look at that, of course, things are much, much easier. But it's unavoidable. You have your national circumstances, and of course, harmonization, that's why I say it's maybe provocative or very ambitious. You do not have harmonization. I think it's in a way inherent to the fact that the taxonomy needs to reflect also the national circumstances. However, where I think I also strongly would convey as a message, if you have your target 1.5 scenario, I think already that it's a big achievement. And if you're science-based, that's a big achievement, because your indicators and on metrics would tend to be, again, pretty much, I'm not saying consensus, but there should be some consensus around that. So we would say that. Now coming to the usability very briefly, a bit now changing hats, a EU perspective. It's true, it's not easy, and we had, and maybe we have in a way the privilege to have, let's say, more resources or people, or can also the financial capacity. So I'm not saying it was easy, but even in Europe, it's true that we realized we need to listen to the stakeholders. So we are listening and provide the tools. And we had provided actually quite a number of tools. I don't know if you want to look at the European Commission's website for the taxonomy. Clearly, you need, as you said, you need to bring in the whole economy, and you need to bring the SMEs, and to make it simple to understand, to navigate. And so we have several tools, like we call them simply the compass, the navigator, the calculator, and they help companies to say, okay, I'm in that sector, it already drops down to which activities you want to pick, which indicators you want, what you want to calculate, your CAPEX, your OPEX. And so it's quite easy. I'm not saying it was maybe so straightforward to develop all that, but maybe that can inspire other jurisdictions that want to help their own markets and stakeholders.
Great, thank you. One of the things I found, which I really liked about the EU structure for taxonomies, there's a mechanism for stakeholders to reach out and ask questions and give feedback, which is so critical to finding out what's working, what needs to be improved in the taxonomy. And I think just to make the link, the work that Azerbaijan is now leading on operationalizing alignment definitely does build on the principles, the G20 principles, which give us a very clear direction, but now it's an opportunity for us to actually agree. What do we mean by do no significant harm in this context? How's it used? How are we going to structure the taxonomy? So there's just some housekeeping, I think a few of you have mentioned, that would really help us just to move. And also, just to be clear, we're using the word harmonization in this panel. We are not tied to the word harmonization. We've heard comparability, alignment, interoperability, and we're trying to find a way through this discussion. So we have 10 minutes left, and I'd like to open this up to the audience. Questions, comments? Yes, please, we'd love to hear from you. We have Makayo.
Thank you very much to the panel for the insightful discussion. My name is Makayo Witte. I work for GIZ, the German Development Corporation, and I'm heading a program on sustainable finance. So we work across countries supporting them in implementing sustainable finance policies. Now, the fragmentation is a real concern. I think that has been established very well, and despite all the efforts that the likes of GIZ, IFC, CBI, and others in this field employ to ensure alignment of new taxonomies, I think we are currently on a trajectory of really hitting the target and missing the point. So hitting the target of many countries being covered and having their own definitions, and missing the point of those taxonomies being sufficiently aligned to shift financial flows. So that on the as a problem statement. So the initiative of COP29, I think, is really relevant and helpful in terms of setting criteria for future taxonomies and how they can be designed. At the same time, I believe one has to acknowledge that there are already about 50 taxonomies out there. So the real task at hand, I believe, is to make those taxonomies speak to each other, those that are already there. And for that to happen, I believe we need to have a comprehensive comparison of those taxonomies, and that is quite a task to do. I think we also need some sort of international mechanism or institution, like a go-to place, an arbiter. Now I have a comment and a question to Mr. Tahirov. So the comment is that GIZ, together with a number of other institutions like UNEP, FI, CBI, PRI, we are working on a tool that could be a contribution to the first part, basically making existing taxonomies available on a web platform to compare the actual text, the activities, the sectors, the technical screening criteria, the governance approach, the disclosure requirements of those taxonomies. Now, that I think can be a contribution to such an initiative, but then there's still, to make real progress, we need this type of international mechanism, and we have the IPSF represented here. I just wanted to put this as a question to you. Is this something that has come up in the COP29 discussions, to mandate an institution, maybe at the United Nations level, with being tasked and acknowledged by the international community as the arbiter of reviewing taxonomies and providing guidance on their alignment going forward. Thank you.
Let me start. Thank you very much. I fully agree the statements you made. Definitely, our aim is global interoperability, and we are interested in working with all stakeholders who are working in this direction, and we are happy to work with you and to benefit the work you are doing for the benefit of this initiative. And actually, you have touched upon important aspects for implementation aspects of a roadmap, which is expected to be endorsed by key stakeholders during COP29. And these are considerations that we are thinking, we are discussing, and I fully agree your statements and your suggestions. Thank you.
Thanks, Mikhail.
Maybe just to add a point, and we know we are not comprehensive, but there are already some comparisons being done. So for instance, EU South Africa, EU China in the IPSF, EU Colombia, that was done. And then, for instance, Sri Lanka said that it's building on the common ground taxonomy, and actually some other jurisdictions, Hong Kong and some other, for instance, are also looking. Clearly, the movement is there. It's not comprehensive as I think you might want, but there is at least already a basis to start understanding this interoperability. And I'm sure that probably Sophia would agree with me that it's not so easy, because you would need, and I think they do a lot of work, and it's very meticulous work and that's why probably we stress this thing on the language, the common language. You need to start by, if we say just, I don't know, buildings, actually it's not so easy, because the definition of activities, when you go more granular, you need to do a lot of work to identify across jurisdictions. So that's why, if I would say stress again, common language.
Francisco.
Thank you for the discussion, very interesting. I got a question for Lucia and Sophia, and also a comment. Let me say before my comment, I think we need to manage expectations on the limits of harmonization. I hear harmonization of labels and terms, that's good, but we also have to be aware that underlying those terms or labels, there are some aspects that are very local. For example, let's say forest. The definition of forest in the UNFCCC process is sovereign. The definition of forest that is used by Brazil is not the same as Morocco. So when we talk about forestation or deforestation, that has implications when it comes to interpret the taxonomy. Similarly, on buildings, there is so much that a building can do, but there is also a set of mechanisms and contexts that surround the building, such as the ability to purchase electricity from the suppliers directly, not only the mix from the grid, and therefore enable the low carbon pathway for the buildings, reducing the scope 2 emissions. That market mechanism may not be present in every country. So I think we have to be aware of those limits of harmonization in order to manage the expectations of the process. Also, when it comes to harmonization, I will say that we may need to pay attention first to consistency on the structure. For example, that do no significant harm is a very welcome element that I see many taxonomies implementing. But there is also what environmental objectives are going to be material or relevant for the country. A country with rich biodiversity and not so much heavy industry may want to prioritize that. And then for other matters, there will be a handful of categories of activities that are going to be universally present and understood in the same way across countries. That's the case, for example, of renewable energy. But it will be up to each country to determine how they manage the risk, like environmental social risk, to avoid no significant harm. So I think those processes will have to be carefully managed in order to have a reasonable harmonization that does not undermine the sovereign rights of countries. Remember Article 2.2 of the Paris Agreement, common by differentiated responsibilities. The context is very important. So my question to Lucia is, what has been the main lesson when it comes to engaging with, let's say, realities that are very different from the EU? When it comes to, first, you have a law, the law is somehow enforced. There can be other realities in which the law may not be enforced. You will have economies with a lot of informality, or the so-called shadow economy. For example, many countries may have most of their emissions coming from the shadow economy, like migrant agriculture, deforesting, cutting, developing some crops and then moving on, something like that. Alluvial gold mining, that is also very present in many developing countries. So what has been the lessons in that process? How to deal with those difficult cases in which, okay, I want to use some of the EU structure, but somehow the country is not there yet. I'm talking about laws and regulations for doing no significant harm, but they may have them on paper, but the capabilities in terms of the state or the government to enforce them is limited. So those lessons, I think, are very important to share. We are going to run into that, especially when we talk about let's do sustainable finance in Africa. That is something key to make it happen. And my question for Sofia from CBI, develop and roll out a taxonomy before all the taxonomies. So, and at some point at the beginning, there was a question, why do we need each country developing their own taxonomy if there is one? So it will be very interesting to have from Sofia the lessons in terms of how do we keep this global CBI taxonomy relevant in light of the mushrooming of many taxonomies that are coming up. So I think that will be very interesting to hear.
Lucia? Maybe just to start reacting to your comment, I think I fully agree with your comment, and that's why I was also noting that, for instance, we prefer not using the word harmonization precisely because of what you said. So 100% agreeing with your comment on. I mean, it's very ambitious, but also I'm not sure if it's achievable and even wanted, because precisely each jurisdiction should be able to, of course, also map the national priorities and maybe prioritize certain sectors. We started in the EU with the climate mitigation and we activities that were covering and the most emitters, let's say heavy emitting sectors. So that was, of course, from an EU perspective, maybe the normal thing to do. As you said, for some others, maybe they are different. And I think we heard about the social being, and we are exchanging with other jurisdictions. Now coming to your question, a bit, we acknowledge that there are these different priorities and different, maybe in the short term at least. Of course, Paris Agreement and climate remains, we think that should remain a global priority. And we all know that climate change will have an impact on many of the other issues. I mean, biodiversity and including social, and probably the most vulnerable groups will be hit more by climate change. So that's a fact. Now, to your question, I'm not sure we are the best placed on that, because we are discussing, we're exchanging with regulators. we think that, and I think you mentioned the question of capacity building both for the stakeholders but also for the supervisor. So clearly it's more as a guess, because we as IPSF were not going into the enforcement issue, precisely because we recognize then it's a question of also, again, national choice. Did I make something mandatory or voluntary? What is my goal also in enforcing and pushing? And I think we, at least as IPSF, were not into that. But just as a kind of guess, I would say, yes, capacity building for supervisors, if you want to achieve the goal, that would be a priority. And actually, this is a thing across, including in the European Union. We have a tool for our own authorities, and there is a tool to provide assistance for some countries that it's a demand-driven. And then as European Union, and I think GIZ is here, and clearly this is part what we call the Team Europe approach for partners outside the EU, to provide capacity assistance when asked, of course, and it's, again, it should be demand-driven and decided by each jurisdiction, to help build that capacity. But it's not easy, and it's clearly not something you can do in one day.
Did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I also agree with that, because 100% harmonization is something that you can't expect, because country requirements are there, and countries may like to build their taxonomies on country requirements. But when tapping the cross-border investments, you may need to think of some harmonization. So the degree of harmonization is that something, the IFC plus other regulators need to think of. But my concern is, now I would like to ask from this, audience, we are talking about, that this many countries have taxonomies now, but how far we have progressed on green or sustainable finance activities? That's a question. Going forward, I don't know, because regulators can't do anything on developing project pipelines. But since GT said and other NGOs are here, some efforts may be needed to boost the demand for sustainable finance.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think this, one of the reasons IFC, and there are a number of teams involved in this, is how can we bring our tools to market development? How can we actually help you turn these taxonomies into investments? Zofia?
I'm at the edge of my seat because I think I've got a good example for you, and that is we are developing and supporting Rwanda in developing taxonomy. And for that, we definitely need to acknowledge that 1.5 for Rwanda means something completely different than 1.5 for Europe. So even though we can use the structure of the taxonomy that EU has proposed, or the principles that we've discussed, to set up the architecture of Rwandan taxonomy, and then to include and reconcile the national priorities within that structure, within that framework. So that's the approach, I think, that answers to your question on how do we take what's already there that might not be directly applicable to local context. This is how we do it, as in the structure and the framework needs to be compatible and needs to be interoperable. And I think that interoperability is the word that we're really looking at rather than harmonization. I think that's what has been emphasized. In terms of CBI taxonomy versus so international global taxonomy versus the national taxonomies, the question is they're not really competing. They've got very different objectives. So the national taxonomies are there to support achieving the strategies of the decarbonization of given countries, right? So they are there to support the priorities that are set by national policies, and they are to steer the financial flows towards the objectives set by strategies. With international taxonomy, that's a reference point for international investors. So if you are an international finance institution and you want to support yourself with reference point on what's green and what's universally acceptable as green, then CBI taxonomy is your go-to reference. But if you want to see what kind of investments a given country needs to achieve its NDCs, well, that's the national taxonomy. And if you think about it, for example, hard to abate sectors, the criteria that we develop as climate bonds, those criteria we try to be as universal as possible to make, I don't know, steel making processes as relevant, and the thresholds we set as relevant for the EU as for the Asian region, which is not definitely two different technology, just two different production pathways. So you lose some depth when you go higher levels of unification, but that's why you need the national taxonomies to help steer the financial flows into the places that their strategies have set. So as was mentioned, the taxonomies are just technical tools. So the end objective is what the policy sets it to be, rather than taxonomy itself. So I think that's really important. And third thing, I think we've said so many times that taxonomies are difficult, but I want to sort of put that myth to rest and sort of give you a recipe, if I may, on how to make it easier for yourself when developing taxonomy. From our perspective, one of the very key highlights that I cannot emphasize enough is to provide and start early engagement with stakeholders and give yourself time, because as colleagues were saying earlier, developing a technical document is not that big of a problem. Like you can have the criteria for each of the sectors relatively quickly. Well, not too quickly, don't quote me on that, but the problem is agreeing that with your national stakeholders, and the problem is agreeing it with the actual users of taxonomy. So and that early engagement ensures your early buy-in into the taxonomy process, and that helps you to have that immediate runoff when the taxonomy is launched. So taxonomy is difficult, but only if you skip a couple of very fundamental steps, and I cannot emphasize that enough, I'd say.
Thank you. Walid.
Thank you. Minding the time, I'll be very quick.
You're keeping us from lunch, Walid.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. In our case in Egypt, our Ministry of Environment has its own classification of all sectorial sheet for all businesses and industries. Is it possible for the members who are not come up with yet with a taxonomy to use such a very technical classification done by Ministry of Environment? And I'm sure most of the members in the room, their Ministry of Environment already have this classification because it's one of their national mandates. Or at least not to invent the wheel and start as a base with this type of classification and build on it while doing our taxonomy. Or it sounds like a bizarre kind of preparation. Thank you.
In the interest of time, I think, Sophia, you have an answer for that one.
I've got answer for everything, clearly. No, jokes aside, I think once we start development process of taxonomies, what we look at is taxonomies in the region, available policies and documents in the region, in the country, that help you define what's green and what works internally. And also what we emphasize also is that taxonomy is not business as usual. So taxonomy needs to be best in class. That substantial contribution, the word substantial is very important, and we have to define like it's not what is the minimum level of ambition, but what should be aspired to. So sometimes that is the problem, reconciling national regulations or national lists with that objective of taxonomy being that next step in ambition. So there's a challenge, I'd say, but definitely I'd never start with sort of blank page. It's always building on what country is already doing, and especially that what country is already doing, so it stems from national priorities. So you do want to reflect that in taxonomy. You do want to reflect that in the process.
Great. So I need to wrap up. Do we have another question? Yes, last question.
Thank you. So my question is for Karina. I want to know what are the next steps of the Council about the taxonomies on Central America, and if you are planning, how are you planning to monitor the the use of this in every country, if you're thinking about that interoperability that Sofia was talking about.
Thank you for your question, Dalma. Dalma is from Dominican Republic. I appreciate your question because your taxonomy is integrated with our. It's integrated or.
Think, speak closer. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes. Right now, you hear me? Our taxonomy is your taxonomy is integrated with our regional taxonomy. So the point here is we are looking for capacity building. That is our main goal right now, with the support of IFC, of course, and Envir Global, that is the experts that they are hired for this task. However, about the monitoring, I think it's important to say that that task is for local taxonomies. Regional taxonomy is a common framework, and that is its objective. So I can say that we are looking for each country, and superintendencies will play a key role here. So I can say that, and we are looking for the capacity building in the next sessions. Thank you.
Thank you. So to get us to lunch, I'm going to quickly just wrap up with a few points. So thank you firstly to the panelists. And this has been a very technical discussion, but I want to share something, and I'll look for nodding heads. Working closely with taxonomies is not something that increases your stress levels. I think it actually starts to reduce your stress levels because you realize that the problems we're trying to work out are very practical problems. They're just a whole bunch of them. So we just need to figure out how do we line them up and find solutions and find agreements. But I tend to feel that we're optimistic, that there are things that we can agree on, like basic templates, basic terms, basic rules, and then things like you've suggested, at least to be able to compare on 1.5 across different jurisdictions. The other thing that I don't want us to lose, it's very important to me, is the innovation that is happening in different jurisdictions on activities that a certain country thinks of that no one else has thought of. And I'll give you an example. China's Green Bond Catalog, my favorite section in a taxonomy ever is sponge cities. I don't know how many people have come across the concept of sponge cities. Put your hand up. They've got a whole section on sponge cities. A sponge city is a city designed for climate adaptation. When there's a flood, the city is designed, whether it's permeable pavements or water catchment or proper water infrastructure, to be able to handle flooding. It's a beautiful concept, and there's even something called a sponginess index for cities. And Durban, by the way, for the South Africans, is ranked on the sponginess index. And so what I would like to end off is that I'm very optimistic about where this is going, and let's keep the innovation happening in emerging markets, because there's so much more financing that needs to be done. We heard from the Dream Team yesterday. We've started the journey. There's lots more that can be done in these different categories of finance. So thank you very much.